One of the reasons why our response to Ukraine has been so limited is Trump destroyed a lot of the intellectual and diplomatic and even physical infrastructure that was necessary. The Koreans dickered over the price, and they're paying the price for that now. The Japanese tipped us. And so Japan is in with the United States almost as if it was American territory. And if this war had happened 5 years ago, Japan would not be participating in the sanctions. Instead, they were the third country to sign up. They've realized what they need to do in the long run. They've found a security sponsor. They're paying us to remain interested. It's working. Ukraine controls 1.5 of those gateways. So that's specifically what they're after here. With a lot of the other interventions in the past, whether it's in Georgia in 2004, Crimea in 2014, Nagorno-Karabakh last year, Kazakhstan this January, that allowed the Russians to get boots on the ground in many of these gateways. If they capture Ukraine in its total, they will now, or would, have access to 7 of them. You're getting pretty close to what they consider success. Yeah, I mean, none of the sanctions that are in place are enough to whap the Russians up the side of the head and give a second thought. But I am quite pleased that the West is not dead. We haven't been able to get NATO to agree to anything of substance, in my opinion, since 1987. And to have the strictest sanctions in human history in place, to have the Russian central bank shut off from all financial avenues, it can't access dollars or euros or yen or Aussie dollars or Swiss francs, even ones that they own are now beyond them. That is an amazing agreement. Like I said, it's not enough. The only sanction that the Europeans might have been able to do that would have made Putin blink heavily would have been just to say we will never buy any Russian oil and natural gas ever again.
Could they even do that though?
Not without a lot of pain.
Yeah.
The Russians, based on which country you're talking, on average, it's 40% of their energy needs. And so if you were to get by without 40% of the energy you needed for the next year, your life would look very, very different. So I understand why the Europeans are trying to have their cake and eat it too, but it's not going to last. There is no way you have a war in a country as large as Ukraine, with as much infrastructure as Ukraine, and with the tactics that the Russians are going to have to use, and that energy is still going to flow. So one way or another this year, probably in the next few weeks, those energy flows are going to shut off anyway. That's not how they think of things. Russians pride themselves to a degree on privation, and the sort of people who would push back against the government are the kind that are eating the imported cheese. They're not the kind of people that are going to pick up a soldier and march, or pick up a weapon and march on Red Square. You're talking about the pro-Western elites, the more educated people, and those people are now trying to find a way out. And from Putin's point of view, he sees them as a net loss, so that's really not a problem.
Right, but there's
he sees their departure as a net win. I said that backward. And the money that they've got left, they can't access it. All their currency reserves, all their foreign currency reserves were out of the country. They can't reach it. All that's left is, I don't have the numbers firmly committed, I think it's about 120 billion in gold. That is of no use in domestic management. And then like 60 billion in yuan, which is yuan that the Chinese don't want back. So they're already there. They're already scraping metal.
Supply hog.
All of their weapon supplies are built domestically. It's entirely possible that they will find that they have some components or some weapon systems that they didn't adequately prepare for, and that will turn the war into more of a slog. But the Russians have 10 times the army that the Ukrainians do, and as so long as no one else launches an invasion of Russia proper or sends regular troops into Ukraine, they will win this. Well, it doesn't make me feel great, but the Russians have done this off and on for 70 years. And so all the people in the West who nuclear policy is a responsibility, they all perked up, they all looked at it very, very closely, and they're like, okay, nothing's really changed. It's just rhetoric. All of I think that the term they use is muscle memory within the nuclear forces. Nothing has moved. This is just Putin being a bit of a prick. It's not something you should ignore, but it's also not something you should overly worry about. I think those are the kind of the top 3 categories here. He is an evil tyrant. He
Yeah.
is a dictator, and now everybody but Tucker Carlson admits it. Even Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders have switched sides finally. Second, he is desperate for his country because he realized that demographically they're in collapse and they have very little time left. And yeah, he wants to be remembered as the next Peter the Great or Catherine the Great, somebody who remade the Russian condition and allowed the country to coast on those successes for decades to come. It's our job to make sure he fails at all three. Be intervening directly because Ukraine is not a NATO ally.
Right.
Also, have you seen the reports of that massive 40-plus mile long convoy coming out of Belarus?
I was thinking that one of our drones could easily take care of that, but
well, it would take more than one. But that's kind of a good example of how the Russians suck at logistics. So if it came to a direct head-to-head fight between the United States and the Russians, one, our military is brilliant at logistics. It's like it's Disneyland, the military, everybody else.
Right.
And the only thing they're better at is taking out a large number of vehicles that are in a line.
Yeah.
So if it did come to a regular war between Russia and the United States, we would wipe the floor with them in terms of the armored warfare and the artillery battle. And then they would feel that they would have no choice but to consider nukes. And so there's no reason to expect the United States to directly intervene. We will play favorites. We are playing favorites. Congress is going to be asked tonight to send at least $6 billion in direct military equipment to the Ukrainians. I figured that'll pass in a matter of seconds. We have sent a whole lot of javelins. We don't know how many, probably at least 1,000 launchers by this point, and every country in NATO is sending everything they have. One of the fun things about NATO is that during the Cold War, there were different tiers of military equipment because some countries were more advanced. When the Cold War ended, everyone spent 15 years upgrading their equipment, and they handed the older stuff to the new allies in Central Europe and Turkey. Now, all of those countries have upgraded their equipment, and they're sending all their hand-me-downs to Ukraine. So there's a metric butt ton of stuff that's going into Ukraine right now. And that is not going to turn the tide of the war, but it means that the Russians will have to pay in blood for every single inch. And once they capture it, they'll be partisans and they'll have to go back and do it again. And the only way the Russians know how to deal with that is to level everything. And this is just the next phase in what the Russia sees as multi-step expansion. They're not done with Ukraine. Well, the soldiers are most of the soldiers are draftees. So you can imagine how they feel about what's going on right now, since they didn't realize that this is what they were going to be in for. For the Russians back in Russia, no. There have been a number of protest movements in Russia over the last several years, and they've got progressively smaller. And when I looked yesterday at the numbers, there were only about 6,000 Russians total that have been arrested so far nationwide. That's nowhere near enough to generate the sort of activity that Putin's going to be even the least bit concerned about. The report I heard this morning from Ukraine, which